They said the world itself had become a graveyard. The streets of cities lay silent, broken only by the tolling of church bells, the creak of funeral carts, and the weeping of survivors. In the years of the Black Death, Europe was not merely struck by death, it was transformed by it. The plague did not only kill bodies, it reshaped the imagination of an entire civilization. What emerged from the ashes was a new obsession, a haunting vision that echoed through paintings, music, and prayer, the dance of death. It is difficult for us to imagine the scale of despair that swept Europe. One day a village might bustle with life, its children laughing, its fields tilled, its markets crowded. The next, half its people could be gone. Death moved like a shadow across the land, invisible but relentless. To those who survived, the world no longer seemed ordered or safe. The church, once the mighty cornerstone of faith, seemed powerless to stop the plague. Priests fell as quickly as peasants. Monks died in their cloisters. Bishops fled their dioceses. Some clergy, risking their lives, stayed behind to minister to the sick, but many did not return. This collapse of certainty shook faith to its core. If God was merciful, why had He allowed this? If prayers and relics could not save, what was their worth? Some believed the plague was punishment for sin, a judgment on a corrupt world. Others saw it as the work of the devil, or of dark sorcery, or even of human conspiracies. In fear and anger, entire communities turned upon scapegoats, unleashing violence against minorities, against those accused of poisoning wells or invoking curses. Yet beneath this fury lay something deeper, a dawning awareness of human fragility, a sense that death was no longer distant, but immediate, universal, and inescapable. It was out of this crucible of fear that the image of the dance of death was born. The danse macabre, as it was called in French, appeared first in paintings on the walls of cemeteries and churches. It showed skeletons and corpses, grinning and decayed, dancing hand in hand with kings and peasants, popes and merchants, young maidens and children. The message was brutally clear. Death spares no one. Wealth, power, youth, and beauty, all are equal when the skeletal hand reaches out. Imagine entering a medieval church, the incense heavy in the air, candles flickering on stone altars. On the walls above the faithful, instead of saints and angels, there sprawls a mural of skeletons dragging nobles to the grave, or leading maidens in grotesque dances. Worshippers bowed their heads in prayer, while these painted dead stared back at them, reminding them with every glance that their time too would come. For the people of plague-ridden Europe, these were not distant allegories, they were reflections of their daily lives. Art turned dark, grotesque, and haunting. Painters filled their canvases with visions of rotting bodies, worms, and skeletal reapers. Music echoed the theme. Laments and dirges became common, with rhythms that mimicked tolling bells or the dragging shuffle of funeral marches. Even festivals changed, with masquerades sometimes including dancers dressed as death, weaving among the living, as if to remind everyone that the dance never ended. But why dance? Why did death not appear as a static figure, grim and silent? Because the plague had shown death as something alive, something that moved among people ceaselessly. The dance of death was a metaphor for its unstoppable rhythm, the way it twirled and spun from one body to the next, never pausing, never tiring. In villages, families watched death leap from house to house. In cities, neighbors dropped in sequence, as if keeping step with some grim melody. To the survivors, it truly felt like death was dancing among them. Religion, too, was reshaped. Many clung tighter to the church, desperate for salvation. Pilgrimages increased. Flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. Others turned cynical, doubting God's mercy altogether. The image of a benevolent creator was harder to believe when graves overflowed and priests themselves died begging for relief. This duality, faith deepening for some, crumbling for others, gave rise to a more desperate, emotional spirituality, one filled with fear and fervor. The church, sensing its waning grip, leaned into the imagery of death. Sermons thundered with warnings of judgment and the eternal dance that awaited every soul. Priests preached that wealth, lust, and pride were meaningless in the face of the grave. The faithful were told to prepare constantly, for none knew the hour when the skeletal hand would tap their shoulder. This obsession with mortality was not confined to the poor or pious. It consumed the nobility as well. Kings commissioned artworks depicting themselves with skeletons at their side. Nobles built elaborate tombs carved with grotesque images of decay, their own effigies lying half-rotted in stone. It was called the transy tomb, a sculpted reminder that beneath rich robes lay only flesh destined to rot. Even in death, they wanted to remind the living, no matter who you are, the worms will find you. The plague had stripped away illusions of permanence. Before, a man might believe his wealth, his lands, his titles gave him some shield against fate. After the Black Death, he knew otherwise. Death was the great leveler. Kings died as easily as beggars. Priests died as easily as heretics. Children, mothers, lovers, all fell the same way. And so art became democratic in its terror, showing pope and peasant clasping the same skeletal hands. This imagery spread across Europe. In France, Germany, Switzerland, England, everywhere the plague had reached, the dance of death appeared. It was painted in cloisters, carved into church doors, etched into manuscripts. Even traveling performers carried the theme, staging plays where actors dressed as skeletons mocked the living, dragging them into mock graves. These performances were both satire and warning, dark comedy that reflected the grim reality outside the theater. And yet, in its horror, the dance of death carried a strange comfort. It told the survivors, "You are not alone in your fear. All share this fate. Your suffering is not yours alone. It belongs to kings, priests, lovers, and enemies alike." In this shared mortality, there was a strange sense of equality. Perhaps that is why the motif lasted for centuries after the plague itself faded. The obsession with death also gave rise to new kinds of art, memento mori, objects and images designed to remind one constantly of mortality. Skulls carved into rosaries, hourglasses etched with skeletons, paintings of young women gazing into mirrors that reflected not beauty, but bone. These were not meant to horrify, but to sober, to remind that every pleasure and power was fleeting. Over time, the dance of death became woven into the very culture of Europe. It reshaped how people saw themselves and their place in the world. Death was no longer a distant inevitability at the end of a long life. It was a partner, always nearby, waiting, watching, perhaps already holding one's hand. Even today, centuries later, echoes of that imagery remain. In Halloween skeletons, in grim reapers, in Gothic art and literature, we see the shadows of those plague-haunted murals. The Black Death may have passed, but the dance of death still lingers, a cultural scar that never healed. Because once a civilization has danced with death on such a scale, it never forgets the steps.